I said in a video about a week ago that I believe that the defining factor of winning fantasy teams in 2025 will be finding the right wide receivers. So I'm spending time today to analyze 33 potential breakout wide receiver candidates in 2025. And fair warning, I do not particularly love the results in this year's analyzation process. But if you do get value from the video, make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So I want to first start out with this, just to let you know what the qualifiers are, because I think there's a lot of breakout videos in the fantasy space that you don't really get actually the right terminology and what actually qualifies a breakout player in fantasy football. So my qualifiers for a breakout wide receiver are you had to play at least 10 games in the previous fantasy football season or your breakout fantasy football season. And the reason I make that definitive quality known is that I need you to score top 12 in fantasy points per game to consider you a really big breakout. And again, the reason I like to go with fantasy points per game is because I do believe that there was lots of guys who were just getting injured throughout their careers and actually had a really good breakout season, but just did not play 17 or 16 games. And so they weren't top 12 wide receiver finishers. I want to see top 12 in fantasy points per game, but you have to play at least 10 games. And then I want to see you finish at least 10 spots higher than your previous year finish. Now, this mostly applies to the guys who are not top 12 in fantasy points per game, but maybe finish as a wide receiver 24 the year before, and then finish as a wide receiver 12 the following year, and so on and so forth. So I don't want to isolate the guys who I only think could be top 12, because I do think there's lots of good breakout candidates who could be good wide receiver 2s, or even stud wide receiver 3s in fantasy football who could break out. So essentially what this part of the video does is it disqualifies guys like Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, who obviously we already know have league-winning potential at the wide receiver position. They can't be drafted as breakout players, though, because they've already broken out. And it also disqualifies previous stud wide receivers in fantasy who are now cheaper prices. Guys like Devontae Adams, Stephon Diggs, Jerry Jeudy, Jalen Waddle, those are guys that came to mind for me. It disqualifies those types of guys. Now, the next piece that I want to cover before we get into the research is the guys that I actually identified last year as potential breakout candidates to show you that this system I have actually does work to find breakouts. So as you can see on the screen right here, this is the list of candidates that there was last year for breakouts. And as you can see, there was a bunch of hits on this list. Garrett Wilson, T. Higgins, Jerry Jeudy, Brian Thomas Jr., Ladd McConkey, Malik Neighbors, Drake London, just to name a couple of these guys. These were all on here. They were identified as potential breakout candidates. So the list does work, and what the research is, it does work, and I do trust the research. So let's go ahead and just get into the depth of the research that I did. So essentially, this big list right here, we're not going through every single name in, but it's basically a study over the past 11 seasons now in fantasy football of wide receivers who took that leap from whatever position they were to finish up 10 spots higher to get inside the top 12 of fantasy points per game. And that was their breakout year. So it dates back to 2014. And what you could see on the screen here is that I was looking for obviously the player, what year they did the breakout, and what the age was and when they broke out. The next thing I wanted to look at was what was their opportunity like? And what I mean by saying opportunity is, were you drafted to be the wide receiver 1? Were you drafted to be a wide receiver 2? Was there targets that opened up? Was there injuries that happened? All of that stuff goes into account. So obviously you can see the first guy on the list, Mike Evans, he was drafted to be the guy. But a guy like Randall Cobb, James Jones had left the previous year, and the slot wide receiver position had just opened up. So there's a bunch of different reasons why guys broke out over the history of fantasy football to be top 12 studs. Then what I'm looking at is the volume here. I want to see what the volume was in that breakout season and what the fantasy points and a half PPR format entirely was. And then I also wanted to see what you did on a fantasy points per game basis. And I wanted to also see if you were a rookie, because those rookie guys obviously need to be taken into account here, because there's a very, very small list of rookie wide receivers who broke out. So you need to take that into account, because most of them were drafted to be the guy. And the last thing I wanted to see, which I think is the most important, is what your previous full season in fantasy football targets wise was like. So essentially it gave me a good blueprint to follow here, because as you can see, my big takeaways here was that the average number of breakout wide receivers per year to go inside the top 12 was about 3.5. The average age of a breakout wide receiver was 23.8. So almost 24 years old is basically around the same time that most guys were breaking out. And circling back to why I wanted to know what your target volume was the year before you broke out, over the course of this fantasy research right here, you could see that only one veteran wide receiver had below 70 targets the year prior to him breaking out. Only 2 vets had below 80 targets, and no players had below 60 targets that were veterans. So that gives us a really good blueprint. You cannot have a breakout wide receiver enter into really good breakout territory if they had below 60 targets. It's unlikely that they would do it below 70 targets as well, and also unlikely that they would do it below 80 targets. So that just gives us a very good metric and a blueprint here to follow. Now, the next part that I wanted to go ahead and break down as well was I wanted to break down the age category, because that was one thing that I noticed here, obviously being a huge takeaway, that the majority of guys who are breaking out before the age of 25. And you can actually see 23.7% of these guys broke out after the age of 25. So the majority rule here that I think is good to stick with fighting breakout wide receivers is you want to target those guys in their first 2, 3, 4 years of their fantasy football careers, because the majority of the time, these guys who are going to be 26, 27 years old, they're not going to be breakouts just as much, just based on what research we've gone through. And I really wanted to see also the number of wide receivers who signed an extension after their breakout, because this is essentially, the reason I think the average age is close to 24 is because the majority of these guys are looking for contracts. So there's extra incentive there. So that's obviously going to be a category that we'll want to isolate a little bit later, because I think there's a treasure trove of breakouts that you can also find on that list. So again, on average, what we're seeing from breakout wide receivers is they're breaking out just before the age of 24, basically right around the age of 24. So we're going to want to target guys when we go through the list of guys that I've got here that are at or around or just below the age of 24. So let's go ahead and unveil the group of guys that I've got for potential breakouts this year. As you can see, there's 33 total names on this list right here, and some of them I like more than others. So I want to go ahead and get into the guys that I like the most, because there's only 2 of them that I really have some serious conviction on. Rashee Rice and Ricky Pearsall. Rashee Rice, I have been pretty vocal about him for the start of the 2025 offseason. I liked him into 2024. I think he would have been really good in a breakout then, but obviously the injury shortened his season right there. So now Rashee Rice is coming back to the Kansas City Chiefs, 25 years old, off the knee injury, and possibly the only thing that could derail him is if he does get suspended. But there's already discussions about that suspension being put off another year, and Rashee Rice fits everything in this criteria for a breakout wide receiver. They made no major moves at wide receiver again in 2025. It looks like Rashee Rice will be the number 1. So as long as he's on the field, I do believe with full certainty this is a breakout wide receiver right here. It's someone that I've drafted a bunch on Underdog already and will continue to do so. And then with Ricky Pearsall right here, also a guy that I really, really like at his price on Underdog as well. Ricky Pearsall is the wide receiver 41, 74.9 ADP on Underdog as well. Again, this is a guy that has tons of opportunities that just opened up for him. Now, the only problem with Ricky Pearsall that he is experiencing is he actually did not fit the target criteria for breakout wide receivers. But I will also attribute that to the fact that he missed several games right out of the gate because he got shot. So I don't hold him to, I really don't hold his feet to the fire for not hitting the target metric that I'm looking for. So with Ricky Pearsall, there's tons of opportunity that's been opened up. He's going to be on an offense that is going to want to throw the ball strategically. So I do believe that Ricky Pearsall is another pretty surefire breakout candidate as long as he's on the field. Now, the next tier of guys that I want to go through right here are also guys that I do believe, based on a couple different factors, also have a good shot of being breakout wide receivers in fantasy football. Matthew Golden, Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir, Jalen Noel, and Jaden Higgins. So let's start out with Matthew Golden. Matthew Golden is the wide receiver 42, 75.9 ADP on Underdog. So with Matthew Golden, he's coming into a Green Bay offense that is really, really good. They've got a great offensive-minded head coach, and I do personally like Jordan Love a lot, and I do think that he has room to grow with a new potential wide receiver one. They drafted it inside the first round for a reason. They want to use him as a primary wide receiver one. While Jaden Reed is still a player that I really like over in Green Bay, he's not your typical prototype X wide receiver, where Matthew Golden probably is going to fit more of that mold, or at least Green Bay will want him to. So I do have him on this list for that reason right there. Keon Coleman and Khalil Shakir, you could kind of give me a coin flip on this one. I don't have a particular favorite. I would prefer Keon Coleman to be the guy who broke out because he's not only cheaper, wide receiver 55, 108.5 ADP, and Khalil Shakir is the wide receiver 45, 79.8 ADP, but also just because Keon Coleman, again, is going to be more of your prototypical X wide receiver if he can actually be the guy to take the leap. Whereas Khalil Shakir, I think, is a really good slot player, but just based on the fact that they have Josh Allen throwing them the football, they are going to fit this criteria for me. And then the other two guys that I like, out of Houston, these two rookies, Jalen Noel and Jaden Higgins right here. Now, I have a clear favorite in this one. I actually prefer Jalen Noel over Jaden Higgins because I think Jaden Higgins is actually more of a similar type of player to a guy like Nico Collins. But Jaden Higgins is the wide receiver 52, 96.9 ADP on Underdog. So clearly a really good value to take right now. Jalen Noel is an even better value though. Wide receiver 65, 150 ADP. So this guy is going almost more than 50 picks behind Jaden Higgins, and this is a slot wide receiver right here. So essentially really all that he has to do is overtake Christian Kirk for slot snaps. And even if he doesn't overtake Christian Kirk for slot snaps, I do think that there's a high probability that Kirk misses games. Kirk is older, and he's been injured in the past already, so I don't think it's inconceivable whatsoever that Jalen Noel could end up being a really good player. And again, the common thread between the guys in this tier, where I think that they could be good breakouts, is the fact that they have good quarterbacks / good offensive coaches. I would say that Jalen Noel and Jaden Higgins are going to both be playing for a quarterback who can easily support two wide receivers in fantasy football. And again, as much as I like Nico Collins as well, this is also a guy who does get injured. He has been injured the last 2 years, so I do think that it's not improbable and not impossible whatsoever that one of these two guys could actually have a really good season in fantasy football. And then the last tier of guys that I do think have some upside here, but they're not my favorite, is Demario Douglas, Kyle Williams, and Trey Harris. Now, I want to highlight these New England wide receivers right here because I think there's tons of opportunity. And again, I can't include Stephon Diggs on this list. Spoiler alert, Stephon Diggs is my favorite New England wide receiver to take. He's also very affordable as well. He's like in the wide receiver 40 range in Underdog drafts right now. But if you don't have if you don't decide to go with Stephon Diggs in your Underdog drafts, Demario Douglas is the wide receiver 77 with an ADP of 182.6. Now, this whole wide receiver room in New England is going to be up for grabs, I think. Outside of Stephon Diggs, when he eventually gets healthy, it's a very unproven group. But Demario Douglas has been at the top of New England in target share the past 2 years. So this guy is not probably going to go anywhere as far as importance goes. I do believe that he will still have a role. And of course, Kyle Williams is the new draft pick for New England, so he's going to be a higher price. Wide receiver 59, 122 ADP. So Kyle Williams is a guy I don't particularly love, to be honest with you, but obviously the main factor that I like here is that I do think Drake May will take the leap as a quarterback. And I do think that he will provide better wide receiver upside in fantasy football in 2025. So I do think that based on that, these guys are guys that I'm going to target in future drafts. Trey Harris, another guy who I think is just going to be a really good candidate based on opportunity and based on quarterback play. So obviously he comes into a room with really Ladd McConkey, and that's it. They have Mike Williams back. Who really cares about that? And they've got Quentin Johnston, who really is mostly a bust. But I do think that Trey Harris could easily take over as the wide receiver 2 in this offense. And again, when you've got a quarterback like Justin Herbert at your disposal, this is going to open up opportunities for you to be a breakout player right out of the gate and finish as a top 35, top 36 guy. And that's really good because he's being drafted as the wide receiver 53 with an ADP of 100.5. So yes, I do think that those top 10 guys are my absolute favorite, but my absolute favorite, the only ones that I really have any confidence in, is Rashee Rice and Ricky Pearsall. And just for the sake of argument here, I want to go through the other guys in this list right here as well. And what I did essentially was I wanted to break them down by particular categories right here. So the first category that I wanted to go through was the guys that I believe have the highest upside. So as you can see right here, Rashee Rice is obviously a guy that I think has tons of upside. Xavier Worthy, I think, has tons of upside as well in Kansas City. Travis Hunter in Jacksonville, obviously the 102 in the NFL draft this year. The guy's got plenty of upside. Rome Odunze coming into his second year, really talented player. Jalen Noel, Josh Downs, Matthew Golden, Jaden Reed, Ted McMillan, Marvin Harrison Jr., Ricky Pearsall. Those are the guys that I believe have the highest upside in fantasy football to be top 12 guys, for example. Now, the next category I wanted to split these guys up in was major quarterback upgrades, because obviously that's going to play a big factor into wide receivers being potential breakouts. And the guys that I identified here are our New England guys with Demario Douglas, Kayshon Boutte, and Kyle Williams, and George Pickens, who is going to Dallas now, is coming from Pittsburgh. So those are guys that are experiencing a major quarterback upgrade, and I included the New England guys because we did not know how soon or how early on Drake May was going to be starting last year. Now that we get a full offseason with Drake May, he's obviously going to come into the year as a much better fit for these wide receivers. So they fit for major quarterback upgrades. Contract seekers is another important one because, again, as we highlighted with the age that most of these wide receivers were breaking out at, these wide receivers were breaking out basically around the time that these guys are looking for new contracts. So these are guys that I think are very, very sneaky to have breakout seasons. Demario Douglas, Kayshon Boutte out of New England. Zay Flowers is a guy that I do think has a very sneaky opportunity to be a breakout guy, but he's not my favorite, and I don't think that he particularly will do this because I think that he's just limited with Lamar Jackson as his quarterback, not providing much upside for a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy. Alec Pierce looking for a contract. Josh Downs looking for a contract. Rashee Rice, another reason I love Rashee Rice. George Pickens looking for a contract. Jaden Reed and Chris Olave also looking for contracts. So this list of guys right here, I particularly find really interesting because, again, it matches up with the age that most wide receivers end up breaking out because they are in seek of a new deal, and that inevitably will make you perform harder and perform better in whatever position you are in life, but especially at the wide receiver position. Now, I wanted to also break these guys down according to best values. In drafts on Underdog right now, there's tons of great values with these potential breakout wide receivers. And again, what I also wanted to do, not only just based on price, but it's also guys that I believe have highest upside because of quarterbacks here. So the Buffalo wide receivers, they're going to be at the top because they have Josh Allen, Keon Coleman, Khalil Shakir. Both of them are wide receiver 45, wide receiver 55. Then you've got the New England wide receivers, Demario Douglas, Kayshon Boutte, Kyle Williams as well. All those guys are bottom 50 wide receivers. Jaden Higgins, Jalen Noel out of Houston. Obviously, you have CJ Stroud, should be upside there. Pat Bryant for the Denver Broncos, a sneaky pick in my opinion, because this Denver wide receiver core is not exactly set in stone. Jalen Royce out of Kansas City, Jack Betch out of the Las Vegas Raiders, also good picks in my opinion. Trey Harris, Matthew Golden, Xavier Legette, and Ricky Pearsall. So again, this is based on Underdog ADP right now, and it's also based on the fact that I believe these wide receivers are in the best quarterback situations that could have potential breakouts to be really good values based on where they're going in drafts. Then we've got our rookies here. These are the guys that, again, you should probably largely stay more away from because as we went through earlier in this video, The majority of wide receivers who are breaking out are not rookies. Only really the top rookies in each class are going to be breaking out. The guys who were drafted to be the guy in their offense. Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas Jr. Those types of guys are really the rookies who are breaking out. So in my opinion, I think it's best to stay away from a lot of rookies unless they are extremely well priced. Now, I want to reiterate this again. I do not particularly love this group of breakout candidates. I liked last year's breakout candidates a lot more than I like this year's. The only two guys that I particularly like are Rashee Rice and Ricky Pearsall. So I'm not going to come out here this year and try to discourage you from taking names like Roman Wilson, who I have in the red. I don't think he's going to be a breakout, but I'm not going to be discouraging you to take that opportunity. Elick Ayomanor, also with the Tennessee Titans, don't particularly love that one. Isaac Tesla and Chris Olave. I don't particularly think that these are great breakout candidates, but they did make the list here. And if you made the list here, you should take the shot on whoever you personally believe in. I believe in the guys in green. You might believe in some of the guys in the red. But if you do want to give yourself an opportunity at the big money this year, you can go down in the comments and grab that link that's there and use code FFN to sign up for Underdog. And when you use code FFN, they will match your first deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus cash. And you could give yourself an opportunity to get in Best Ball Mania. $25 draft, $2 million to first place. The Puppy is a $5 entry. That's $100,000 to first place. The Schnauzer is also $3. That's another $100,000 to first place. I won $19,000 playing Underdog last year for doing these drafts, so of course I'm going to endorse you taking the opportunity to win one yourself. So let me know who your favorite breakout candidates are for 2025, and if you want to see the top 30 wide receiver rankings for 2025, click on this video right here.